Hi guys! Tonight we're just going to do a little bit of an excerpt reading. I have been editing Coetir, which was the first release of my Druid novels, and I'm really liking how the first chapter is turning out, so I thought that would be a really fun little read for you guys. Then at the end of the video I'm going to read an excerpt from chapter 1 of Kaya, People Among Us. There is still a little bit of time left if you guys want to get in on the Kickstarter. I'll put the link down in the description box so you can check it out. Hope you guys enjoy. Let me know what you think. I used to watch them every weekend. When Father went out to work in the fields, I was allowed to leave the house and stand near the perimeter. Ever since I was a child, I stood there and watched, looking for them until my mother called me home. I sat on the very edge of the boundary line and peered through the trees, searching for the people of the wood. Of course, I knew better than to ever take so much as a step beyond the boundary. Father had warned me of the dangers. The people of the wood were not to be trifled with. If they ever came near me, I was to leave. Mother didn't even want me that close to them, but Father overruled her. There was no harm in watching, he'd said. Better that I know what was out there than that I be left in the dark. I think I know now why Father really wanted me there. He wanted me to see their rituals, hoping I would learn to fear them. He started letting me watch them whenever I'd finished my chores, and so I found a way to go almost every day. When the leaders of the colony saw how fascinated I was with them, they even granted me a place at the perimeter, much to Mother and Father's chagrin. But the leaders were amused by me, or so Father had said. They were amused by the little girl who wanted to be brave. But I was brave, wasn't I? The Druids were the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. In some ways they looked like us, like humans, but in others they were almost too different to describe. Their bodies were humanoid, 2 legs, 2 arms, 1 head between 2 shoulders, and they wore pearlescent white clothes that turned brown near their bare feet and hands, as though they weren't regularly washed. They moved silently through the wood. I'd never even heard their feet crunching on autumn leaves. In some ways they were like the wood themselves. The hair that sprouted from their heads was like vines and brambles, and the females even had flowers growing within the strands. Their skin was light violet, but in the light of the setting sun it turned a deep shade of green, allowing them to vanish into the night. I couldn't stay at my post when they shifted. Mother believed they would deceive me, even if given the slightest opportunity. These things were all I could see from the boundary line, but I knew their eyes and faces were different too. Though I couldn't tell what it was, I knew they weren't like human faces I saw at home in the village. I'd taken the time to sketch them from time to time, to sketch what I saw out there in the wood, sketches I was sure to never show Mother. Now, while I watched them from my station at the perimeter, a male druid, one who looked no older than me, was led close to the boundary between the trees and the fields. I hid in my blind so I could more easily watch, and I held my breath as the male was forced by one of the 5 older males to kneel. This was the first time I'd seen any of them so closely, and I studied them as well as I could. The slats in their noses where mine had 2 simple nostrils, the lavender shade of their fingernails. Their black eyes, black all the way through, though I still imagined I could see where they were looking. I made note of every single thing, knowing I'd have to draw them from memory. I hadn't had time to grab my sketchbook before leaving the house. No one had ever studied the Druids as far as I knew. These beautiful beings right at our doorstep, and no one had ever thought to learn about them. So I did what I could. I'd even watched them performing rituals before, but never so close to the boundary, and there was always a female present, seemingly overseeing the ritual itself. There was one in particular, one who looked more important than all the others, who led the majority of the chanting rituals. I wished I knew what they were doing. When they spoke to each other, it was like nothing I'd ever heard before, but I'd never been close enough to hear their voices before either. Idishin Svira, one of the older males, the eldest of the group, I guessed, said. He took hold of one of the other male's arms, one who held a blade in his hand. Vurthgurrs, the man with the knife replied. If ledar urash. Nidi fader fiod nal, one of the others added, taking the knife away from the one and placing it at the kneeling male's throat. The kneeling one tilted his head back, and as far as I could tell, he was stoic about their apparent desire to kill him. I took the opportunity to take in his appearance most of all. He was the most still among them, the one I could see best remember at the end of the night. The slats in the bridge of his nose on the sides, and his nose barely protruded off his face. Those beady black eyes seemed to stare straight toward my blind, and if I didn't know better, I would have thought he was looking directly at me. His pale violet lips were slightly pursed, his hands and arms relaxed at his sides, seemingly resigned to the fact that they would kill him. His skin was the most interesting thing of all. It was almost like tiny scales, as if he was part reptilian, like the lizards my brother was always catching and slipping into my clothes trunk, and it was changing shades now, ever so slightly, from deeper to lighter violet. "Evening there." I wasn't sure who said it. Once the words were spoken, the knife was pressed into the flesh of the kneeling male's throat. I watched in horror as pale white blood trickled from his flesh, and I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to keep from shouting when the body simply vanished. The five slowly made their way back into the wood. I stayed where I was. There was a rule in our people that we could not enter the woods. For safety's sake, most of us didn't even approach the boundary. Generally, it was only the younger ones who dared to come so close to the edge, aside from those who guarded it, of course. The treaty with the Druids said that we would not enter their territory, their sacred grounds, and that they would not enter our village. It was an island we lived upon, and their land surrounded ours. In return for our remaining within our village, they would not cast their spells on our lands. My father had told me stories of a time before the treaty when our peoples used to hunt in the woods. He said the Druids had poisoned their water and caused locusts to destroy their fields. Most of us were still superstitious enough to believe it could happen again, and most of us as children had watched the Druids performing their rituals and learned it was safer to leave them alone. I was not one of those. I'd been watching the people of the wood my entire life, and I never wanted to stop. I'd even been granted a position on the perimeter, even if I had to prove myself more than others, for the simple fact of being a woman. The men of the village have never trusted the women, and I always blamed the people of the wood. Those who run their rituals, who perform them and see everything out, are the females. From what I could tell, they held the most power in the clan. I was one of the few people brave enough to watch them and not look away, even when one might be looking straight at me. Elam sighed as he watched the elders walking back from the crossroads. Elders who, in any other time, would not have borne much of the weight of their people at all. The witch should have been the one to guide them in all things. But now, he shook his head. What were they thinking? Each of them knew the Untouchables were watching, and they'd killed Marieke anyway. Sarah wouldn't have approved. For that matter, did this mean the crossroads were opened now? Sarah had been the one who carried down the line of witches, those who created the treaty for the crossroads, and now she was dead by Marike's hand. Without anyone to carry out her line, he had no way of knowing what would happen. Marike had destroyed their very way of life by taking the witch. Without Sarah, the Coetir had no one to guide them. Sitting within the branches of a tree on the edge of the crossroads, looking down on one of the Untouchables, Elam watched. The girl had watched, transfixed, while the elders had taken Marike and stolen his essence. He thought she would cry out when Marike's essence was taken, but instead she'd simply cowered farther into her thicket of branches. Curious. He'd never seen one of the Untouchables, as the villagers called them, so closely. Never before had he come so close to the crossroads. The woman had light brown hair. It looked soft, almost like fox's fur. Her eyes weren't black like his. They were light white like fresh clouds and green as fresh spring leaves. And her skin, it was unlike anything Elam had ever seen. Pale and smooth, the color of the sandy island shores. She didn't have scales covering her body, and she never changed colors. He would have thought the fear would have caused it to change, like it did for the Coetir. Too long, the witches had kept his people from the Untouchables. Too many generations held at bay. If the laws had permitted it, he would have gone to see her, closer. But there was no way. Even without Sarat, who carried on the lines and laws, it still wasn't safe. The Untouchables did not follow the Vartus. It was not safe to associate with them. Not yet. Without the Vartus, the Coetir's whole way of life would be gone. Even without Sarat, they would hold on to the Creator's guidance. The Vartus would reveal the next witch. The Creator always provided for them, though all the witches had been born of the line of Shea before now. Sarat had no heir. She'd never chosen a mate with whom to form an heir. She hadn't provided for them as she should have done. As far as Elam knew, this was the first time anything of the sort had ever happened in the history of the Dwyn. Even among the Anialich, the Maenad, and the Dur, it was unheard of. The Coetir were the first to lose their witch without a suitable heir already in place. The stories went that the Dur had often lost their witches in days long past, though as long as Elam had been alive, their witch was Saranai, the pale beauty of the sea. The Coetir elders had been named, and would fast and consult the Vartis before the new witch would be revealed. She would be chosen from those who had trained with the witch herself, he guessed, but it would be a woman, chosen to train them in the ways of the Vartis, and she would define their future. He wondered if this was what Marike had intended. There was no other reason to explain why this had happened. Sarah had been a good witch for the Coetir. She taught them well. Marike had said as much on many occasions. Elam's eyes widened as he watched the untouchable woman stand from behind her hiding place, fully revealing herself. She was slender, like the Coetir, but shorter in stature than many of the adults Elam knew. He wondered how she would compare to the rest of the Dwyn, the other druidic beings of their world. Without so much as a thought, he jumped down from the treetops, landing well inside the Coetir's side of the crossroads. When he landed, his eyes looked straight into hers. Her jaw dropped, her blunt teeth now clearly in view, and she took a single step back. She made no sound save her feet crunching on the leaves. He'd never heard that sound come from anything but an animal. "Hello." He didn't know why he'd said it. As soon as she replied, he turned away. He didn't listen as she spoke, but he stopped in his tracks when he felt her presence beyond the crossroads, the presence of the Vartis moving with her every step. At that moment, he knew nothing would be the same. The treaty said that none would cross the line, neither human nor Coetir. Crossing the boundary meant the breaking of the treaty and the breaking of everything he'd ever known. He turned his head toward her, toward that beautiful, untouchable woman, and he watched as she crunched across the golden leaves, slowly making her way toward him. "Aros os gualishinda," he said. "Wait, please." Her eyes said that she didn't understand, but she did not speak. She only met his gaze and slowly inched closer. Crunching echoed all around them, and his eyes fell to her feet, marveling that they created the sound. Never in his life had he seen someone so similar to him and yet so very different. Someone capable of making a sound when they stepped on the leaves. "Eros," he said again. "Wait." He should never have shown himself to her. He'd seen her curiosity and he'd exploited it. Also, he could see her a little closer. He didn't even really know why he was here, why he'd come down from the branches at all. He'd never intended it. His thoughts had only been on the future, on all that had happened this day. Sarah would never have allowed this. The witch had never even allowed them so close to the crossroads. The untouchable woman should never have been so close. She should never have been allowed to cross into their land, and she shouldn't have been so close to him now. It wasn't safe. But it was like fire under his skin seeing her so close. Elam's skin lightened reflexively, curiously. She'd already crossed the safe zone and was almost completely across the boundary. He recognized the curiosity in her eyes, one he felt certain was reflected in his own gaze as she stepped ever closer. Whatever reason had been within them was now abandoned. Her arm reached toward him and Elam flinched away, but he didn't stop her. He froze, the power of the Vartis tangible in the air around him. Never in his life had he felt it so strongly, so powerfully. A fear he'd never known pulsed through his veins as she reached out once more and placed her warm fingertips against the cool skin of his arm, the pair drawing in a unified breath. The sound of the wood immediately returned. Birds sang their songs, wind blew the leaves in the trees. A rabbit scurried from the bushes further down the crossroads. "Ushnol," he said, "go back." Her brow furrowed, her eyes wide, as though she'd understood. "Ni alich fadima," he continued, his eyes pleading. "You cannot be here." "Yes," she replied. Even her voice was beautiful. In an instant, she removed her fingers from his skin and ran. Elam only watched, his senses noting everything in those moments. Sarit's ancestor, Corinne, the first witch who'd lived in the time of humanity upon the islands, had begun the treaty between their people and the Untouchables. It had only been a few years then since the humans had arrived here. They'd already destroyed the land, and the Coetir had attempted to destroy their efforts. This land was holy. It was not to be torn apart to make way for them. The colonists had met with Corinne peaceably, and the treaty was created. The boundary, the crossroads was set, and they were not allowed to expand beyond it. In all their years, only one human family had not been included. One, and they were long gone. Not everything that had been said about the Untouchables was true. He knew that now. It couldn't be true. Untouchables, the witches had always called them. Sarah herself had said that to touch one of them would cause a Coetir's skin to shrivel and dry, and immediate death would ensue. The earth would have its revenge for the blending of the peoples. Humans had given up their purpose. They no longer recognized the Vartis. Because of this, the earth no longer desired the Untouchables to remain, and as children of the Vartis, the Coetir could not touch them. But the woman had touched him. The Vartis had forced him to be still and allowed her to touch him. He'd seen how the earth had reacted to her crossing the line. The birds had quieted. Winds ceased. Clouds held their places. Even the earth herself had frozen in place. And then the woman had touched him. All had gone back to normal in that instant. The world continued around him. His skin did not dry. He'd never been so frightened in his life. The elders would have him killed for allowing this, if they ever found out. Some things from the very beginning were never intended to last. It was so with the Druin. From the very beginning of our time on this world, we knew it was not to last. This planet always had an expiration date, and humanity was always to be its final inhabitant. Our people had come to this world to assist them, to show them the light and bring them back to their paths, to the place for which the Vartis had created them. We'd done so to the best of our ability, in every place save one. My sisters, Hithor of the Mainid, Fari of the Coetir, Sierra of the Kedwig, Isilt of the Anyalik, and Serenai of the Tur, were all coming to my land now, the center of life for humanity, the plains. This was the only place where our people had not yet been revealed to humanity, the only place where we were as yet unknown to them. Though their people told many stories of the lands beyond theirs, of rabid creatures that lurked behind every hill, tree, and precipice, they had never looked upon us with knowledge in their eyes, with the understanding of what we were. They had never accepted the fact that we ever walked among them, my people, graced with the ability to move through this world in similar fashion to humanity. Only one human had ever seen us as something other than the rest in all our time. She was special to us. I'd seen it from the time of her birth, and I'd attached myself to her in the only way I knew how. For a time, I had hoped she would come to be our chosen one, but before we even had the chance to speak with her upon the coming of her adulthood, her essence was stolen from beyond this world by the cruelty of Esferos, the evil one. When my people first came to the world, we'd smitten his followers down into the depths and recesses of darkness, where they could never again be made to return. But here in the plains, humanity worked against us. Humanity had released Esferos and his followers after him, the Diafol and Kithrol, allowing him to work his magic upon their hearts and minds, turning them away from the Vartis. And so my people hid in the shadows, the creatures of legend hidden amidst humanity. We'd been sent here long ago, after the death of the great mother Shea. My sister had taken over in her stead and sent us all away. Corinne she sent to the islands, Yeshu the waters, Zet the southern jungles, Hithor into the mountains, myself here to the plains. Shevu was the only one allowed to stay behind, there in the desert lands. But it had now been many years since her passing. For the first time since those days, since my sister first sent us all away to guard after the world of the Vartis and prepare the way for the next coming, we were about to be gathered together once more. A small part of me had hoped this day would never come, that the end would never reach us, but it could not be avoided forever. Eventually, the humans of the plains, the largest settlement upon this world, needed their minds to be set right. They needed to know what they had done, how they had stepped off their intended path, and how to return. We are the last, the people of the plains. My sisters have already said their goodbyes to their people, their kinds taken back out of the world and up into the heavens. Only Cayau remain, my people, the last of the Derwin, the final remnant of the Vartis' attempts to reach humanity. It was a strange feeling knowing mine were the last. I'd never understood why I had been chosen for this task, why Shevu had elected to send me to the plains where humanity had already begun to build their civilization. At the time, I had been one of the youngest of my sisters. I had only recently come of age, with Hithor the only one to follow. But her people had been among the first to leave, and mine the last. Shevu's life had ended far sooner than any of us had anticipated, and our youngest sister, the sister who had not chosen to follow in the path of our mother, was brought up into the place of the witch. Isilt had come into her own since then, in the many decades since she'd been thrust from her place of comfort by our father's side. Fari's fate had by far been the most difficult. While the rest of us had our people spread out through a vast land, while we did our best to keep our kind united despite the distance between us, the Coetir were always united in space. Fari's people had always been close to each other, always had the strongest bond of all Duin. The sisters all felt her pain when the time had finally come to let them go. None of us had wished for her to feel such pain. Some had even counseled her to begin letting go of her people long before the time came, but Fari had never been able to carry it out. Technically, she was not one of us. She did not come directly from the line of Shea. Corinne's line had ended for the sake of her people, and Fari merely picked up where Seret, Corinne's descendant, had left off. We all thought of her as a sister nonetheless. She was one of us, in a way, whether she had come from Shea's womb or not. Serenai's had been the simplest farewell to her people. She'd already been well known for her preference of being alone, and when the time came it was a bittersweet goodbye. She'd hardly been different since her people had gone, except in that she more frequently came to the water's edge to speak to me or Fari now that she was alone. The young one always brought a smile to my eyes. Her mother had been a good friend of mine, though had deftly hidden it from her people. Duer witches changed so frequently that we all expected Serenai to last little longer than Arnea before her, and yet she'd gone on as witch for many years. She'd grown strong in her detachment from her people. For Zera, it was the journey that plagued her. Her people had only finished leaving this world a short time ago overall, and I'd had no choice but to call on her as well. She was reluctant, wishing to stay behind with the humans who'd taken her on as part of their family, but in the end she knew she must obey. The Vartis had called them all here with my voice, and they all must heed. I felt them all, even now as I stood hand in hand with my people, surrounding the whole of the plains as we did every dawn that brought in a new week, to pray over those within our lands. I felt my sisters drawing near to us, each of them coming from their own land in their own way, coming to help us bring light to the children of the Vartis. My eyes opened as our prayer faded, and I released the hands of my people. Now we would disband and return to our places, each of us, for the duration of the night and the day beyond. These prayers might not continue after today. I felt it in my soul. My people were being pulled and stretched, and we could not continue as we always had before. As yet, only one human had ever discovered us in the action. Most preferred to stay indoors once the sun went down, and all of them were still too convinced that the creatures of shadow were not real. But my people were here, all of us, confined to the shadows by the humans themselves. When they saw us, they pointed and laughed. When they noticed us cowering in the quiet places, they sneered. But the Vartas had graced us with an appearance similar to humanity, one close enough that we easily hid among them, to the point that most believed us to be human, afflicted by some disease. It wasn't always that way. The half-breed, the child of human and Duin, came to us many years ago and showed us the way. A plague was devastating the plains, deforming humanity as they perished. He brought them the cure and showed my people how we could now live among humanity. Before that time it had been nothing but a dream to us. We'd lived in the wilderness outside the villages, unable to venture within. Now we lived among them, and they were none the wiser. We were the infected in their eyes, those who had been deformed by the axe of a plague long gone, those who were not worthy of much. But it gave us the opportunity and position we desired. The Vartas could use us here. Only one, the same who had discovered us in the time of our prayer, ever realized what we were. I had hoped she would be our chosen one, that through her our people would finally come into the light of day and be known for what we truly were. But it was not to be. Mari Orthax was her name. She was the daughter of the Earl of the Plains, the leader who had united all villages under one name. Before him there had been much strife and disagreement, more reason for people groups to split apart and go to the lands where my sisters dwelt. On the birth of his daughter I'd placed myself within his home. I'd nurtured her as a child, the caretaker chosen by her mother. But it was not to last. Mari's father had united their people for Aspharos, for the Vile One, to ensure that no more humans would leave the plains to join the care of my sisters. In every other land save the plains, the Vartas had been brought into the lives of humanity. Here, and here alone, did strife and suffering continue. Did people still live in the fear of the future of their fellow man? I'd wished to change that. So I'd kept in the shadows and taught Mari what I could, but Orthax soon caught me and had me removed from her sight. Her life was then shrouded from me, until the day she came to us and heard our prayer to the Vartas. I had hoped even then that she would remain, that she was the one, but something called her home and she obeyed. Her life was a shadow, hidden away from my visions until the end. Mari's death was the beginning of the end. My sisters were even now on the way to join me to help my people defeat the wiles of the Wicked One. Aspharos was not a new enemy to any of our people, though this was the first that we would engage him in battle directly. He had been fought by Duin before, in spirit battles for this world, and he had been locked in the depths of this planet where our people had believed humanity would be unable to reach him. We were wrong. It was because of Aspharos that Mari did not come to be our chosen one. There had been a time when I'd believed the prophecies would come through in her, that she was indeed the one, until the day I realized why she never came back to us. The first she'd seen us, she'd spoken to me. She'd recognized me. I saw in her eyes that she'd been enthralled with us, entranced with the reason behind our prayer. It was this that showed me how much she longed for a new world, a world where she would not feel the need to fear what was going on around her. She'd wanted to believe in beauty and in peace before her time had ended many years ago. I knew now that the spirit of Aspharos had come upon her himself, in order to spread his wickedness through this world. His seed took root in her and choked out all possibility of what she could have been for us. The carrier of the evil one could not be the chosen one of the Vartis. She had lost her strength, her will, and she'd allowed the vileness of Aspharos to come upon her. She'd carried his child to full term, despite what I saw as her best efforts to end her own life. But there was nothing even I could do for her. In my true form, I was not pure in the eyes of the humans. As a human, I was not allowed anywhere near the gardens of the House of Earls. Mari went through it alone, every step of the way, unto her death. Her own father, the Earl of the Plains, had been unable to bear it. He'd taken his own life only shortly after learning of the demise of his only daughter, leaving only the husband, Tamak, to take on the duties of the Earl, not even knowing that the child he referred to as his own could never have been wrought of his own loins. No, Salam was the child of darkness, the spawn of Aspharos himself, designed only to carry out the will of his true father. The child of darkness even now walked upon this world, raised up above even the might of his grandfather. His human father's life was failing, which is why I had been forced to call upon my sisters. There was no choice now. The son of evil was about to be raised up to be the leader of the plains, and there was no telling what horrors Aspharos had in mind for these people. The rest of the world would be safe. The Vartis would care for those who had already called upon the Creator, but the peoples of the plains were in peril, and my sisters and I were the last line of invisible defense against an enemy they didn't even know they had. The heart of the Vartis was torn by these people, by their actions and their choice to stay as far away from the Creator as possible. Kaya had tried everything we could think of to turn their hearts, to sway them, but only a few had ever come to see our side. Our appearance had become both a blessing and a curse, both the way in which we were able to move so freely among these people and the reason for which we were shunned from them. But at least we were unlike the others of Dewin, and we were able to show ourselves outright to humanity, all thanks to the half-breed child, whom we'd all thought an abomination before he came to the plains to pave the way for us all. "My lady," Jehiel's voice cut through the darkness, bringing a smile to my face. I turned toward him and held my hand out for him to take, thoughts of the past pushed to the side as I looked into the eyes of the young Kaya man, my joyous one. "What is it?" I asked. "Serenai and Fari have breached our borders," he said. "They await your presence at the lake shore." With a smile, I dipped my head to answer him. He was the most human of us all, by the looks of him. The scales of his skin were faded enough that only the brightest of sunlight revealed him for what he truly was, aside from the ridges upon his brow and nose, and the color of his eyes, the things most humans took to be a deformity that had come upon their people during the disease times, when my people had first shown themselves to bring healing to this land, after the time marked by the half-breed. "Come," I told him. "They will want to meet you." He squeezed my hand and released it. "I will await the others," he told me. "Tira and Hithor should reach the southern border soon." "As you wish." I could not help but smile upon him, but marvel at the beauty of this child of the Vartis. Jehiel was, without a doubt, the best of us all. He knew his place among our people, knew that he stood beneath the rule of the witches, that he desired nothing more than to serve the will of the Vartis. Such became his birthright. He left my side once again, and I watched him leave. I'd watched him his entire life, from the time he was a babe, grown from nothing into one of many miracles among my people. It was Jehiel who was sent to me after Mariorthax had first met our people. Jehiel who had whispered so many prayers beside me as I sought the name and face of the Chosen One, and Jehiel who had searched for the Chosen One for so many years since Mari's death. He was my right hand, strange as it might have been for my people. Usually the witches of Dwyn worked alongside the Penaith and young witches only, but Jehiel had a special place in my heart. He was not like the others, though he would never have wished to be seen as anything but one of the Cayau, a follower of the Vartus. As silent as the night, I walked with my people back toward the nearest of the villages. I wished them well as they went their separate ways, going into the places where they would sleep away this night, whether a home of their own, or a place given by the rare kindness of humanity. But my mind was upon my sisters. They would have come to me themselves if something had not been amiss. I felt it in my bones.